welcome to Ministry Monday. I'm your host, Amanda Bruce. Today on episode 119, I discuss the nuts and bolts of music ministry. I discuss how digital planning and preparation, especially in an almost all virtual arena currently in light of COVID-19, has changed the way we see ministry and plan for ministry. Today, on part one of this episode, I speak to Patrick Nisbet. Patrick Nisbet is the founder of Liturgy Help, which is a comprehensive liturgical planning guide online. I highly recommend, if you haven't heard of him, to listen to this next episode. Okay, today on Ministry Monday, I am speaking with Patrick Nisbet. Hello, Patrick. How are you doing?
G'day, Amanda. I'm well, thank you.
Good. Thank you for speaking to me on what is my dinner time, but is your beginning of the day. So thank you for taking the time this morning.
It's early and cold here.
Well, I'm grateful for your time today. So Patrick, I'm speaking to you today because I don't want to say you work for Liturgy Help. Can you just share a little bit about what position you are in your job and what diocese you live in?
Sure. I'm the founder and CEO of Liturgy Help. We were the first web-based organization to put the Catholic liturgy online about 21 years ago. So we've been doing this for a long time. So I founded the company about 21 years ago and been basically running it since then.
Great, that's great.
The diocese is Hobart. Hobart's the capital of the little triangle at the bottom of Australia. So that's my diocese, though I'm actually a Queenslander by birth, which is on the other end of the country.
Great, okay. So today we are speaking about liturgy, of course, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't have our listeners gain a little bit of insight and context into what you are living in an experience every day in Australia. So if you wouldn't mind sharing, what are some of the changes that you've seen in Australia because of COVID-19, both as a country and liturgically?
Sure. Australia's had it pretty easy compared to the rest of the world. Our first wave of COVID, we only had 200 deaths for the entire country. We went into complete lockdown in March, and then that was we were released from lockdown gradually throughout June. We basically were COVID free for the entire country, except for people in hotel quarantine, people coming from overseas. And then it escaped from that in Victoria. So the 5 million people in Victoria, particularly in Melbourne, have all had to go back into lockdown. And since then, there's been about 300 extra deaths, mainly in nursing homes in Victoria. So initially with COVID, like you guys, there was, this isn't that serious, and then all of a sudden it just went bang and we had to go into lockdown. From memory, just before Easter, because I ended up having to do all the readings in my parish. So we tried to do a very small group of people who would come together every Sunday and through the Easter Triduum to just do a very basic mass that we, or service that we live streamed on Facebook Live. And that was repeated wherever people had the technical skills. So if you had a geek in the parish, basically, who knew enough to put a phone on together and Facebook Live or YouTube it, they would do that. So that was probably only about 10 or 20% of the parishes in the country managed to do that. A lot of them are very, very small. So the larger ones and the cathedrals did the sort of live streaming, particularly through the Easter ceremonies. But that was a real shock to everyone. Like, it was like to not have the Easter ceremonies was sort of like so foreign. And in terms of the liturgical experience, like the dissonance between what we would normally do with the high, particularly at Easter, the high liturgy, and then this pared back liturgy, and then the tension between, the simplicity of it, not having altar service. Like, do you have altar service? You shouldn't have altar service because they're not really necessary. But, there's that tension in the liturgy, and cognitively, it took a long time, I think, for people to get their brain around all of that and the shift that happened. So yeah, that was the initial, and then we've gone through that period, and then coming out of lockdown, masses have started again, but with restricted numbers. So we have a 4 square meter rule in Australia that says we can only have one person per 4 meter. So people have had to book in to go to mass on a Sunday and that type of stuff. And so numbers are low, and then working out, whether you have an offertory procession, which I think you shouldn't, probably, by the guidelines. How do you give out communion? Some of the tensions around that, and in particular singing. So some parishes have continued to sing. Most parishes have sort of changed to just have a cantor and an organist, and try and discourage congregational singing. But it's a mixed bag depending on the priest and the diocesan guidelines. And we have parishes who are very vigilant and other parishes aren't so vigilant, sort of thing. So yeah.
It sounds very similar to what the United States is facing in terms of consistency and different rules with different dioceses, and also, truthfully, like you said, just different priests enforcing it in different churches and cultural backgrounds. So it sounds very similar. Yeah, it sounds very similar. So let's transition a little bit, and let's talk a little bit about planning liturgically digitally. So the topic of this episode overall is how to plan for liturgies digitally in all different ways. And to many, especially you, I'm sure this is very common practice. But there are people who didn't necessarily consult many digital liturgical planning aids prior to COVID-19, prior to us being so isolated. So what are some of the benefits to adapting and depending more on liturgical planning digitally during this time?
Sure. Well, there's a very practical one, which is the books. Often the books are expensive. They're in the parish center. You can't go and grab them, and you can't rip them up and share them. That would be obscene. And they're too big to photocopy. And that would be illegal. So having all the books, all the ritual texts available digitally is a great benefit. And also being able to have a single point of reference. If you agree on a digital liturgical resource for the parish, then people you can make that available to multiple people across the parish so that they can work collaboratively, be working from the same point of reference. So suggesting music, then you could have a Zoom meeting like this and be working with a shared screen, that type of thing. There's a broader issue in terms of liturgy as well. So how do we, and community building. So how do we extend our ministry into a non-gathered? John Roberto, when I was in youth ministry, used to talk about gathered and non-gathered ministries. And it struck me that was a real idea that has come to fruition in the COVID time. And so how do you reach out to people via email and make stuff available and encourage parents to work with their children, encourages families to sing together, to pray together. So without focusing specifically on Liturgy Help, but what we did is we took a whole lot of our resources that were in PDF format, but because they were normally printed, they would be 3 pages together or 5 pages together in some places. So we wrote some algorithms to break all those pages up, and we made all those pages available individually. So say a musician or a catechist or a parish priest can grab the one individual page, email it out with some instructions to their families in their parishes, some suggestions on how to use it, that type of stuff. So we created a whole section called social isolation, and added in family prayers and that sort of stuff, and the office as well, for Sundays. because in the initial phase of how do we cope with COVID, there was a lot of discussion as to whether, certainly in Australia, whether a mass was the correct thing to be doing via um, video link and Facebook Live, and some people suggested that the office was also a valid option in that whole process. It's the prayer of the people, it's the prayer of the church, and so we try to create that balance between the two. So yeah, but essentially digital resources, making it easy for people to email them out, to share them, to work together on screens with them, to pray together via Zoom. That type of stuff is the sort of vision we had initially. So yeah.
I think you said something really interesting that I just want to touch back on too, especially right now in this time in our history as a church. I think liturgical planning might even be, I hope I'm not sounding absolutely, ridiculous when I say this, but I think liturgical planning is even past the liturgy. You said something about, of course, planning family prayers and sharing family prayers. I think this is an
Sure.
unprecedented time in that way. And so digital planning aids could help with not just liturgical planning, like you said, but expanding the faith experience for families as well.
Yeah, indeed. Like we have the idea of praying over a meal and that sort of stuff,
Mhm.
and certainly the Catholic culture is not necessarily focused. Well, we tend to be focused on the Eucharist, like the Eucharist, summit and source, and so there's this, and so, and when the Eucharist isn't available in its fullness, what are our options? Hence the office, but then hence liturgies of the Word that families can do around the kitchen table. They can sing together if they're given the tools to, and we all have hymns that people know and know off by heart. It's actually one of the biggest questions we've had from our users is where can I get the hymn words? Because traditionally, certainly in Australia, that's hasn't been a big thing because we use hymnals a lot in Australia. So printing hymn words has never been an issue for most parishes. So we've run that line with one license and encouraging people to get the correct licenses from one license, ensuring that that's all okay. And then one license is the key source of those words if they need them. So it's but it's exactly that. It's how do we extend the experience of prayer and liturgy into the family church, and encourage people to engage in the Sunday readings. In terms of Liturgy Help, our focus is very much on the Sunday Gospel, and making that available in a whole range of different ways. So children's worksheets, for example, that are PDFs that can be emailed out. And whether that's to parents or grandparents, in our experience, it's often the grandparents who want to have access to this stuff because they're often looking after the kids, and they want to slot the catechetical worksheet into the sort of into the time and create an opportunity to talk to their kids around that sort of stuff. So yeah.
Let's talk about Liturgy Help. I think this is a good time to do so. So, um, I'm sorry to be so blunt, but let me just ask for our listeners, what is Liturgy Help?
Sure. Liturgy Help came out of an idea I had when I traveled to the US 25 years ago, probably, which just occurred to me that there was a lot of duplication of work. People sitting there typing out readings every Sunday. The web was barely existed back then, the World Wide Web. The internet had been around for a while, but the World Wide Web was just an emerging technology. And so I thought if we started to put together this sort of resources, the stuff that people do week in, week out online, that would be a boon to the church and to ministers. And so that's what we worked on for the last 20 years. So essentially it's everything you need, the lectionary, the missal, it's the US lectionary, it's the US missal, Spanish, the US lectionary in Spanish, the US lectionary missal in Spanish. Everything's adapted to the particular. So we publish in Australia, UK, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, New Zealand. So each country is kept completely separate with their own local liturgical calendars. So around the core of the texts, which include the sacraments and the sacrament texts, we augment that with a whole range of resources, from scripture commentaries to homilies and reflections, to prayers of the faithful, children's catechetical resources, and of course music and psalm setting selections. So we have, so if you go to Liturgy Help and click on a Sunday, there's just an enormous wealth of resources there. Sorry. Enormous wealth of resources there in digital format, ready to use. And it uses like the data. So it's all about the data. So for example, you can click on a particular gospel and it will tell you what hymns are specifically related to that gospel. You can click on a first reading or an entrance antiphon and grab what the specific readings, hymns are related to that, that particular text. So yeah, that's Liturgy Help in a nutshell.
That's a lot.
It's people generally go, my God, why didn't I know about this previously?
Yeah.
And we've been doing it for years. It's in Australia, 50% of the parishes, 50% of the schools use Liturgy Help. It's extensive, like it's, if anything goes wrong, like on a Monday or Tuesday in Australia with our site, it's sort of like the phones start ringing because it's what people do on when they come in for the week and start getting ready for the next Sunday. They log onto Liturgy Help and start grabbing the gear that they need. And that's the thing, is we don't tell you how to plan liturgy. We simply provide a whole range of resources that then allow you to do what you need to do. We had a priest down here who said, it's like a liturgical supermarket. Like you go in and pick the bits that you want, and some things you would never ever go to, and some things you would go to every week. It just depends on your ministry, your context. And so, yeah. And the addition of Spanish in the last 12 months has really made that much more useful for the American church as well. So,
yeah, I agree. So along with Spanish, are there any other new benefits that we need to know about from Liturgy
sure.
Help?
We've added 2 recent additions just actually yesterday. So one is now an ability to listen to readings in English and in Spanish, and listen to prayers, the missal prayers. So you literally just click a button and any of the readings are read out to you. So for people who English isn't their first language, or people who Spanish isn't their first language, that's a really useful tool. They're very clear, they're very precise readings, so that's a great new addition. The other thing is, after feedback from the conference, we have added a new feature that allows individual users to suppress any particular composer. So if you go to your profile and then there's a liturgical preferences composers section, and in that you can just go through and click any composer, and that will be generally removed from, that composer will be generally removed from the suggestion lists. There are some places where they may appear where they're sort of embedded in PDFs and stuff like that, but in general, from a data perspective, that composer will be removed. So we had that sort of feedback from the conference, and so we've added that to the system. So yeah.
Great, great. So to wrap up, if anyone wanted to learn more about Liturgy Help and see if it was a great option for them, where would they go?
Go to liturgyhelp.com and then select trial. If you went to the conference, you get a 4-month free subscription, or trial. So if you're on the conference list, just mention it in the comments section or in the follow-up emails, and we'll make sure that you get your 4-month. Generally, it's a 1-month free trial for non-conference users. So that's the way to do it, and we
Excellent.
can get you online, pretty much straight away.
Great. Well, Patrick, I want to thank you for your time today. Thank you for giving us some ideas on how to plan past the liturgy, not to ever disrespect the liturgy, but to, like you said, maybe extend to the family church a little bit more and to think in a new way. So thank you for your time today. Thank you for everything you're doing for liturgy and ministry.
Thank you.